نصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. Respectful honorable friends, in yesterday's majlis I had mentioned to you how important it is for a person in order to remedy themselves and in order to complete this task of tazkiyah, how important it is for a person to have somebody as their spiritual guide, their murshid or shaykh. And the duty and task of this person is that we will go to them with regards to the inner illnesses that we suffer from and have them remedied. And at the same time, the shaykh is our means and our jumping board to reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, which is a dua, that Allahumma inni as'aluka hubbak wa hubba man yuhibbuk wa hubba amalin yuqarribuna ila hubbik. That Allah, I ask from you your love, Allahumma inni as'aluka hubbak, your love, and wa hubba man yuhibbuk, and the love of those who love you. And then Nabi Kareem mentions wa hubba amalin yuqarribuna ila hubbik, and the love of those amal, those deeds that will lead towards your love. Here you'll find Nabi Kareem sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentions the love of Allah, and he mentions love of amal, those deeds that will lead a person towards the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now these are very important things. But you'll find in between, in the middle, Nabi Kareem mentions وَحُبَّ مَنْ يُحِبُّكَ, and love of those who love you. Now you may wonder what's the need for Nabi Kareem sallallahu alaihi wasallam to make dua there and say وَحُبَّ مَنْ يُحِبُّكَ, love of those who love you as well. But the reason is to show us that the bridge or the connection between Allahumma inni as'aluka hubbak, or Allah asks from you your love, and the amal that leads towards the love of Allah, the bridge between the two and the connector between the two is وَحُبَّ مَنْ يُحِبُّكَ, love of those people who love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the mashayikh. That you have love for them and to have a connection with the mashayikh, this is what leads us and attaches us between the two, meaning between the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and those amal and those deeds that lead towards the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And by means of being in the company of the awliya, they are the ones who give us that push towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that big push that we need in reaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Shaykh Abdul Ghani Fulpuri rahimahullah would mention in his a poem of his in Urdu, the meaning of it, which is that the mashayikh, they are the shortcut to reach to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is it? You have a huge field, and you want to get to the other side, you walk all the way around to get there, and the other is you just walk in between and you get there a lot quicker. So he mentions that the mashayikh, they are the shortcut of reaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of becoming close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they are our means of becoming close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Jalaluddin Rumi rahimahullah gives an example, and he says that the arrow cannot fly without the bow. And we are the arrow, and the bow is the mashayikh. That by them, by means of them, we can fly and we can reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, become close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he also gives an example, he says, this way a person cannot reach the top without a ladder. In the same way, the mashayikh, they are the ladder for us to reach, for us we can climb and become close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In order for us to reach the high stages of becoming a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the ultimate of each and of tasawwuf and tariqah, and this should be the aim and ultimate of each and every single person. As I mentioned to you before, we have somewhat become content that we just want to live our entire lives only doing the ibadat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whereas further than that we can do more than that, and more than that is that how we can acquire direct connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And direct connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is what we call nisbat. And nisbat can be attained by means of being in the sohbat, in the company of those people who have nisbat with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or those people who have been in the company of those people who have nisbat with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are our guides to reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. An example I give of that is Sat-Nav. Or Sat-Nav navigation system. Now in your countries you'll have different types of satellite navigation, and that here we now the common one is TomTom, which you'll find in Europe as well. And the task of that is that if a person wants to get from A to B, all you do is you type in your destination and then you follow the Sat-Nav. And if you follow the Sat-Nav, you'll get to your destination. But because it's been programmed that it knows where your destination is, and it will take you to the destination. In the same way, the Mashayikh, they are there so that they can show us our destination, and destination is Wusul ilallah, is to reach towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because we do not know the path, we do not know the route, we do not know the way of reaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they know the method, they know through which amal, through which ibadah, through which means we can become close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they are the ones who show us the route. Now if a person has Sat-Nav, and they have placed in the destination, that person will only reach the destination if they go according to that navigation. If where it says turn right, you go and turn left, you say, no, why should I turn right? I want to turn left instead. And you go and turn left. And if you do your own, you'll find instead of going to the North Scotland, you'll end up south into London. You'll end up in the opposite direction if you start doing your own. Whereas if you follow what the navigation says to you, it will guide you and it will drop you off exactly at your destination on the doorstep of where you need to go. And the Mashayikh, their purpose is this, that they are our navigation in reaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We follow what they have to say, the route that they have shown us, and as long as we remain on that route, what will happen is we will reach our destination. And at the same time, the navigation system that you have, you'll have something IQ routes as well. And that is where it will calculate the route in such a manner that it will avoid and it will remove certain other areas, meaning areas as in where there is a lot of traffic hotbeds, and other places, direction that you won't want to go. It will remove those. So it will show you a direction which will allow you to reach your destination as early as possible. To reach your destination as early as possible, it will direct us in such a manner. And the Mashayikh, this is exactly what they do as well. That they will show us the route, and all we need to do is follow that route. And in following that route, there will be a lot of things not for a person not to do. That do not take this route, do not take that route, and do not take that route. Because if you take these routes, then what's going to happen is we're going to end off the track. We're going to end up somewhere else. And this navigation, this route, is what we call tariqah. This route is what we call suluk and tariqah. That a salik is a person who is on the path of suluk. And that path is that navigation to reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's on that path of how he can reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if he now thinks, because obviously it is his first time he's on this path, he has never walked this path, he has never traveled this before, so he cannot work out his way on his own. He needs the guidance of somebody who will show the path on it. And then, once you have the path, it is important that you stick to the path. Otherwise, again, you won't reach your destination. Our destination is to become close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The only way we become close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is if we continue on that path that takes us towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As I mentioned to you, on that path there will be a lot of things, a lot of exits and paths that we should not take, and that is to stay away from all those things that are haram. All those things that are haram. Those are those routes which we don't want to take. On this route and this path to reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we just need to be taking all the positive routes. And that is all the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We must make sure that we are doing these things. That's why it will tell you as well which exit you need to come off and where you should be coming off. Now there's an exit there. Now instead of staying on the main road, you take the exit and you come off. What's going to happen is you're going to come off the main road. Again, you're going to go get lost. So in the same way, on the path of suluk, Shaitan has left and kept a lot of exits. A lot of exits. And inviting people towards those exits. And the salik who is walking on this, who is traversing on this path, will very easily be inclined towards these exits, and he comes off this exit, and by coming off, he's off the main route. And that is by means of all the haram things that we have. And these are all those obstacles that is going to deprive us and deny us of our destination, which is qurb ilahi, which is the closeness and nisbat with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Hence imperative that we stick to this route. And from these exits are few examples I've given to you with regards to all the various desires and temptations and haram that we have in the heart. And the other is all those other forms of external things that are haram. Because it is very, very important. That person who wants to become close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he has to and must stay away from the disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The person continuously disobeys Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then he's not going to be able to traverse the path of suluk. He's not going to make any progress in reaching close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For that he has to stay away from all those things that are haram. Otherwise, whatever good he does, from the good that he has done, he'll get the reward of it, but he won't get the spiritual benefit of it. And this is what our example is. We do ibadat. From the ibadat, we've discharged our duty, we'll get reward for it, we'll get sawab for it. But the spiritual benefit of it, that we keep on losing. And we lose this because of our disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And suluk, tasawwuf, this teaches us how to protect these things. We do zikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now when a person sits and does the zikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he remembers Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he becomes very close to Allah. And by doing the zikr of Allah, he is giving his soul ruhani food. My Shaykh who mentions the zikrullah, zikr, this is nourishment for the heart. It is food for the heart. Just the way we eat food, and that food gives us energy and strength. In the same way, the remembrance of Allah, the zikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is energy for the heart. If you do not eat for a few days, what's going to happen is we're going to become weak. If we do not eat at all, we're going to die. In the same way, if we do not remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, spiritually we'll all die. As Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam mentions, مَثَلُ الَّذِي يَذْكُرُ رَبَّهُ وَالَّذِي لَا يَذْكُرُ مَثَلُ الْحَيِّ وَالْمَيِّتِ. The example of the one who remembers Allah to one who doesn't remember Allah is like the living and the dead. The one who remembers Allah is like the living, and the one who doesn't remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like the dead. And the living and dead means spiritually. Because we can be living as in alive physically, but if we do not remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are like the dead. Meaning spiritually we are dead. So nourishment for the heart is the zikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Without this, a person dies a spiritual death. And the more he does the zikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more strength he has spiritually in his heart. Now here again, we do the zikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and by doing the zikr of Allah, we have acquired in our hearts the spiritual nourishment, ruhani in our hearts. But now instead of us safeguarding that ruhaniya and protecting that ruhaniya, what happens is that we disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and by disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whatever we have acquired, we let it out again. We lose it. We lose it in this way. Hence, it is very, very important that a person stays away from all the disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our example is like a water tank. You have a water tank which has a tap with it as well. And then when that water tank is finished, you're going to fill it up with water. But you'll only be able to fill the tank up if you've made sure that the tap is closed as well. Now here, if a person has a tap open, and on top he's filling the tank with water, he's filling it up with water, what's going to happen? Whatever he fills inside the tank is going to come out from the tap. Whatever fills in goes out, whatever fills in goes out. In this way, his whole life he'll keep on filling water in it. Have a permanent hose pipe there. But never will that tank become filled, because the tap is open. if he just closes that tap, then whatever he'll fill in the tank will remain full in that tank. To that extent, that then when that becomes too full, it will overflow as well. It will overflow as well. And this is what our condition should be, and this is what the condition of the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala was. That ruhaniyah should be so much that so much ruhaniyah enters into our heart, that it should be filling up our entire hearts. It should be filling up our entire hearts. To that extent that it becomes so full that it exceeds as well. And then it overflows as well. And this is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran with regards to the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala, سِيمَاهُمْ فِي وُجُوهِهِمْ مِنْ أَثَرِ السُّجُودِ. Well, Allah says, سِيمَاهُمْ فِي وُجُوهِهِمْ مِنْ أَثَرِ السُّجُودِ. The sima fi wujuhi min athari sujood. On their faces you can see the sign of sujood. And where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says this in the Quran, Nasima, the sign of sujood, does not mean any physical sign on the forehead. It doesn't mean this at all. But sometimes we think that a person who has some dark marks here on the forehead, that this person is a punctual namazi, has been performing his salah for so much. No, that isn't the case. The sign of sajda is not any physical marks on the forehead. But Sima, Mufassirin Mullah Al-Ma'alusi Rahimullah mentions, Sima huwa nurun, yazhuru min batinihi ila zahirihi, that when Allah Ta'ala mentions Sima, that Sima is what you can see on the faces, the sign. That what is this sign? He says, huwa nurun. This sign is nur. Yazhuru min batinihi ila zahirihi, that becomes seen and apparent from the inside to the outside. This means it is such a nur, that by them doing the sajda, the ibadat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so much nur enters into their heart, that nur now fills their hearts up, and that nur then comes out and you can see that nur on the faces. This is what Sima is. But this is because they made sure that the tap was closed, so that the heart can be filled with the nur of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what we do is, we do the good deeds as well, but at the same time, we leave the tap open, and because of that, everything that we acquire, it goes out, because of which we don't feel ruhaniyat, and we do not feel any spiritualism within our hearts. Another example, on one occasion, my Shaykh, and this is the benefits of having a Shaykh, who will guide us on the right path. Now my Shaykh was traveling with his Shaykh, and they were traveling from Jeddah to Makkatul Mukarramah, and it was very warm, hot as well. So whilst they were traveling, the car that they were in, the car wouldn't become nice and cool. The AC was on, but still the car was too warm. Now my Shaykh, Shah al-Haq rahmatullah alayhi, he asked the driver, why isn't the AC working? So he mentioned that maybe somebody's window is open. Somebody has left the window open. So then they looked, and at the back, one of the windows was open. So the window was closed. The moment the window was closed, the AC started working. And we all know for the AC to work, you need to close the windows. So the AC started working and the car became nice and cool. Shah al-Haq rahmatullah alayhi mentioned that look, this is the same with our example as well. That we do ibadat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we do the dhikr of Allah, we perform salah. But as soon as we finish the ibadat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what happens is we leave the window of our eyes open. We leave the window of our ears open. We leave the window of our mouth open. We leave the window of our hearts open. So that now instead of that coolness staying within the car, the windows are open, the AC goes out. In the same way, whatever ibadat we do, instead of it staying within our hearts, and keeping within our hearts, circulating within our hearts, because our eyes are open, meaning we go out, we do not protect our gazes, so that nur is gone from our eyes. We go outside, we listen to haram. We've done ibadat, and then immediately after that we listen to haram, we listen to music. We listen to somebody's backbiting, ghiba. So the nur, we've let it out from the ears. And then we go and we make ghibat of somebody from the tongue. We slander somebody from the tongue. We swear somebody from the tongue. So what happens now is the nur that we acquired, we're letting it out from there. Or we have pride in the heart. We have jealousy in the heart. We have illicit love in the heart. So because of this, whatever nur that was supposed to stay within us, we're now letting it out because the window of our hearts are left open. And because due to this, we don't have any nuraniya or any noors remaining within us. Whereas the moment the windows are shut in the car, the AC will start circulating in the entire car and bringing coolness. In the same way you will find where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبِ, that by the dhikr of Allah each soul acquires itminan al-qulub, peace and contentment in the heart. But this peace and contentment can only come when the heart is closed. Then the dhikr of Allah, by the dhikr of Allah, the nur can then circulate in the heart. If this nur circulates within us, then only will we be able to acquire itminan al-qulub, sukoon, tranquility of the heart. When the AC now circulates in the car, everybody finds coolness. And today we find every person wants coolness in the heart. Every person is looking for coolness. That how can I settle my unsettled heart? How can I settle my unsettled heart? And the only way we can settle our unsettled hearts are through the dhikr of Allah, through the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But which form of remembrance? That form of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala which is going to remain in our hearts. Which are going to remain in the heart. Which is going to stay there. And which is going to circulate in the heart. Only that form of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what's going to bring contentment and peace in our hearts. But for that, it is important that a person stays away from all the ma'asiyat, all the disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now in this incident I mentioned to you, these are from the benefits of having a shaykh. My shaykh was with his shaykh. And his shaykh, Shah rahmatullahi, had mentioned such a beautiful example from something that had happened at that time. Something that had happened at that time. And that then became a lesson for a person to learn. And then obviously I have heard that from my shaykh. And now you've heard that from me. And others, you'll pass on to others as well. These are from the gems of the mashayikh, and it is these gems of the mashayikh that we should value. But we'll only acquire these when we obviously are in the company of the mashayikh. And then you find that in the same journey of theirs, in the same journey, they came and they stopped at a petrol station. And when they stopped at the petrol station, there was an oil tanker. Oil tanker came, and the oil tanker had oil been filled in it. They were filling up fuel in that oil tanker. Shah rahmatullahi mentioned that look here, this oil tanker, which has gallons and gallons of oil, fuel on top of it. So much fuel on top of it, which will then it will distribute to other petrol stations. It has so much fuel on top of it. But that fuel is of no use to the tank itself. Because it needs to go to another petrol station where then you can fill the petrol from that petrol station into that tank. Into that lorry, that truck. So the fuel and the oil that's on top of it is of no use to itself. In the same way he gives the example that you have those people who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given ilm and knowledge. But that knowledge is just there as a burden on their back. And neither do they benefit from it, and neither does anybody else benefit from it. Because if you want oil, you can't just flag down that tank and say, look, you've got so much oil in there, give me some fuel. You can't. So nobody can benefit from it in that way. And neither does that oil benefit the tanker itself. In the same way, we mentioned there are those people who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given ilm. But the knowledge is just a burden on their backs. They've got the burden of knowledge. But neither do they benefit from that knowledge, and neither do other people benefit from the knowledge that they have on them. There is another example. Another lesson given was just on this short journey. And you'll find that more and more person stays in the company of the mashayikh. What happens is, their qualities rub on to us as well. And proof for this is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself mentions was in the Quran. That يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَكُونُوا مَعَ الصَّادِقِينَ. يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَكُونُوا مَعَ الصَّادِقِينَ. That where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اتَّقُوا اللَّهَ, that oh you who believe, people of Iman, اتَّقُوا اللَّهَ, fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Have taqwa in your hearts. And how will you acquire taqwa? Allah Ta'ala Himself mentions, وَكُونُوا مَعَ الصَّادِقِينَ, and be with the sadiqeen, be with the truthful ones. Ay muttaqeen. Be in the sohbat, in the company of the pious. And by being in the company of the pious, you will also acquire piety. Because taqwa is important, imperative. Without taqwa, a person cannot become a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in order to acquire taqwa, a person needs to be in the company of the muttaqeen. So if he is in the company of the muttaqeen, then he'll also acquire taqwa. And where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكُونُوا مَعَ الصَّادِقِينَ, why مَعَ الصَّادِقِينَ and not مَعَ الْمُتَّقِينَ? Because صادقين refers to the muttaqeen. But why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say صادقين and not directly the muttaqeen? Sadiqeen just means truthful ones. Because truthful, any person can be truthful as well. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not saying here, Sadiqeen, just be in the company of the truthful ones. But here he refers to the muttaqeen. Why? Because when you go to the muttaqeen, make sure that they are truthful in their taqwa as well. They themselves are truthful in their taqwa as well. Because if they are truthful in their taqwa, then only will you benefit from being in their company. And their taqwa will then rub off onto us as well. Allama Alusi rahimahullah mentions in the tafsir of Kunu ma sadiqeen, ay khalituhum litakunu mithlahum, that when we go in the company of the mashayikh, we go in the company of the pious, of the muttaqeen, then how long should we stay with them? How much should we remain in their company? So he mentions, ay khalituhum litakunu mithlahum, that become so close to them and remain with them so much that you become just like them. And this is why we go into the company of the mashayikh, so that by being in the sohbah, the company, is what has an effect on an individual. And that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكُونُوا مَصَادِقِينَ, that be in their company so much so that you also become like them as well. And where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran even commands us, وَكُونُوا مَصَادِقِينَ, a person may think that fine, I've understood, I need to be in the company of the Ahlullah, I need to be in the company of the mashayikh, the muttaqeen. Then where can I find the mashayikh? Are the mashayikh or not? Because you'll find in today's time, there will be those who will be under the misconception that in our times we do not have the likes of Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jilani rahmatullahi, we do not have the likes of Junaid Baghdadi rahimahullah, Bayezid Bustami, and these type of awliya that we knew of before. So who should we go to? Hakeem al-Matawi rahimahullah mentions in Bayan al-Quran that here where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكُونُوا مَعَ الصَّادِقِينَ. Now in Arabic, kunu, this is an imperative command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَكُونُوا, and remain, be in the company of the muttaqeen. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding us something, because kunu means halul istimrar, the imperative command indicates towards present as well as future tense. It indicates towards both present and future tense as well. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding us to be in the company of the pious, but it can never be that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us to do something, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not create the means for it. When He says be in the company of the pious, that at all times there will be such pious people in whose company we can go into, by whom and by means of which we can become close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Otherwise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not command us such. Then it will be a case Allah Ta'ala is saying to us, be with the mashayikh, be with the muttaqeen, but where the ahlullah, where the muttaqeen? It won't be like that. So the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala command shows us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always keep people for us, who by us going in their company we can become close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they may not be like the caliber of the Junaid Baghdadi and Bayezid Bustami of their times. But at the same time, the murideen, the disciples are not like the disciples of their time either. But you will find, in order for this to be carried out, implemented, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always keep people available for us. It is for that reason you find, when one wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala passes away, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replaces him with somebody else. There will always be somebody there in whose company we can go to, for our tazkiyah, for our reformation, and who can become a means of us becoming close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Otherwise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not have commanded us وَكُونُوا مَصَادِقِينَ. But it is just a case of us searching and looking for that person, having first of all that desire and then searching and looking for that person, and you'll find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala desires and wants to make somebody close to Him, the first thing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala links him and attaches him with a beloved of his. That is the first step. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to look, I've chosen and I want this person to become mine, then the first stage is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will attach him with another wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that by means of him and by means of his sohbat and by means of his ta'lim and his instructions, by his sohbat and his company, he will then become a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the first stage. Hence, for that reason, if any person wants to become a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, tazkiyah is imperative. And for that it is imperative to have somebody or the other to be in the sohbat of the awliya, and this is guaranteed. With my life I can guarantee to you, nobody can ever will not become a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or have his or her tazkiyah done without going through the mashayikh. Without going through the sohbat of the mashayikh, this is impossible. Somebody do it and prove it in the life and come and tell me I'll change my bayan, but it will not be the case. It has been the sunnatullah. It has been the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the time of Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and it will remain such. And it is for that reason that even our great mashayikh, as I mentioned to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, would go in the sohbat of Jafar Sadiq rahimahullah and say, if it wasn't for him, the time I spent with him, then I myself would have been destroyed. Imam Shafi rahimahullah would go in the company of the mashayikh. Imam Ahmad would go to Al-Qasim As-Sufi rahimahullah. So even these who were great mashayikh of their time, but even they realized that in order for us to become close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we too need to learn the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by those people who themselves have the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is if this is what we want. But if we do not desire this, then fine, do not go to the mashayikh, do not stay away from the mashayikh of the awliya, from the majalis of the awliya, but by doing so, all we are doing is we are depriving ourselves of nisbat with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And finally, Shah Abdul Gharib Fulpuri rahimullah mentioned so beautifully in Urdu, and I shall say it, that where he says that aam milta hai aam walon ke paas, kebab milta hai kebab walon ke paas, sabzi milta hai sabzi walon ke paas, aur Allah milta hai Allah walon ke paas. Where he says, you want mango, you go to a person who sells mangoes. You want vegetables, you go to somebody who sells vegetables. And then you want Allah, you need to go to the Ahlullah, you need to go to the people of Allah. That's where you let Allah. So, this is how important it is that we are in the sohbat of the pious and in the sohbat of the mashayikh. So by means of that we can also become close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all the ability. We shall continue tomorrow. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.